Queens Public Library is approaching the final days of its 125th anniversary year, and we're celebrating by announcing March 19th as QPL Day. Keep checking queenslibrary.org for upcoming giveaways and more. During this year's celebration of Women's History Month, QPL honors the leadership, strength, and power of all individuals who identify as women. We salute our local trailblazers who, thanks to their determination and hard work, have made significant contributions to Queens and opened a world of opportunities for generations to come. Learn more about our celebrations at queenslib.org/WHM 2022. Tax season is here. Queens Public Library has compiled a resource list of partner organizations who can provide you with virtual tax help this year. Visit our blog on queenslibrary.org for more information. Try BrainFuse Help Now, which offers live online tutoring and homework help every day from 2 to 11 p.m., an adult learning center, a 24-hour writing lab, and more. Visit queenslib.org/brainfuse to access this online service.
Welcome to Queens Public Library's talk with John Glatt, author of The Doomsday Mother, Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell, and the End of an American Family. I'm Brian Alessandro. For those of you who don't know me, I have written for Interview Magazine, Newsday, Penk, Huffington Post, and I've recently adapted Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story into a graphic novel for Top Shelf Productions, which will be released this fall. Additionally, I co-edited an anthology of essays and interviews about William S. Burroughs, which will be published this summer. I am also the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the literary journal, The New Engagement. My first novel, The Unmentionable Mon, was published in 2015 by Cairn Press, and my first feature, Afghan Hound, was produced by Marriott Media in 2011. Culture Connection, curated by Daniel Zaleski and now in its 8th year at the Queens Public Library, is proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film. Now expanding into a virtual format, Culture Connection is currently reaching a global audience. John Glatt has been an investigative journalist for over 30 years and has written 30 books, including Golden Boy, about which I interviewed him in October 2021, and has appeared on Dateline NBC, Fox News, ABC's 2020, BBC World News, and A&E's Biography. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, John.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
My pleasure. It's our pleasure. So this story of Lori Vallow, a former Mormon from Idaho, and Chad Daybell, a religious zealot preparing for the end times, is so disturbing, shocking, and fascinating that I need to leave it for you to summarize.
Well, it was fact is stranger than fiction, and when I heard about it, I really couldn't believe it and had to investigate further. I mean, Lori is in fact from Rialto, California. She came from a very interesting family. They were Mormons, but her parents were very unusual. They were 5 children, and they were left very much to their own devices. And the parents would often go off to Hawaii and leave Lori and her brothers and sisters alone in the house to fend for themselves. And the Mormon religion, really kind of predominated their lives. And as years went on, Lori became more and more involved in it and sort of corrupted it in a way.
Mm.
And it wasn't until that she met Chad Daybell, another Mormon who was in fact from Utah, that it was like gasoline and fire. And this is the catalyst that the book is about, and the case.
And so I guess let's sort of jump right into the horror. In addition to her two children, 7-year-old son JJ, who had autism, and Tylee, her teenage daughter, Lori and Chad are also implicated in the suspicious deaths of their former spouses, Charles Vallow and Tammy Daybell, as well as Lori's brother Alex and third husband Joe Ryan. Please talk to us about that. That's four.
Back to the beginning to see how that all evolved, really. But it's once they met, they really started a religion, or Chad started a cult, and basically he was teaching, he was identifying whether people were light or dark, and it evolved into whether they were zombies or not.
Right.
And Lori and Chad, all their husbands, their wives, their children, they became zombies in their eyes,
Right.
and they had to die. But you really have to go back to the beginning to see how that evolved.
It's really fascinating. As I was reading your book, I kept thinking back to my graduate school days when I studied clinical psychology, and I thought about folie à deux, this idea of a shared delusion. And I think that that is the engine of a lot of cults, is that it is able to sort of get people under the sway of a kind of a collective delusion, to the point where otherwise perfectly rational people are regarding their children and spouses as zombies.
Yeah, and that was what was so terrifying to me. I mean, I've done 25 true crime books. This was the hardest and the most terrifying one I ever did, because of the cult aspects of it. I mean, Chad Daybell, to look at him, he was very doughy. He was kind of overweight, very non-charismatic for everybody that knew him, but he could get in front of a group of people and really hypnotize them with his tales of Armageddon and the end of the world. And, it was amazing, the people he managed to sway and convince that, he was a true prophet. And of course, with Lori, when they met, she was a very, very good looking blonde lady. Chad was kind of, he'd been married for nearly 30 years. His marriage was kind of not where he wanted it to be. And suddenly he got this beautiful lady, Lori, and it was his goddess. So he kind of evolved the religion to kind of capture her into it, because he wanted to be with her.
Really?
That's where everybody fell by the wayside, the spouses and the children, where so Chad could get his way.
Yeah, really, really chilling.
Totally, yeah.
And so Lori was enamored of Chad's doomsday books, of which he'd written 24, and beliefs that the Armageddon would be fast approaching. Was it July 2020 at that time? And it was essentially a cult, as you said. And some of these outlandish beliefs, in addition to believing that they were on this divine mission to rid the world of zombies, they also thought that they were gods, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Chad preached, he didn't invent it. It was something that went further back in the Mormon religion, the 144,000 that lead the followers into the next world of the second coming of Jesus Christ. And Chad told Lori that when they met, first of all, they were reincarnated many, many times. They'd had many past lives. And he told Lori that they'd in fact been married 7 times at least before. And they were like a god and a goddess. And Lori was so narcissistic, it really fed to her. She believed it. And Lori and Chad believed that they were leading the 144,000 into the second coming of Jesus Christ. And there were many people that believed them too and followed.
It's always so fascinating to me how you can get so many people to follow along in such a kind of ludicrous, to believe such a ludicrous scenario.
You've got social media, I mean, and it's like false information, which is going on a lot now.
Yes.
And that fed into it. I mean, the internet very much. And they used to have these prepper rallies where Chad would talk. They put it online and he'd get his followers as well as his books. Now, Lori's interesting because when she got into the idea, the prepper is people preparing for the second coming.
Right.
So by mass quantities of food and stock up for, the end time so they could survive. And, in caves or in tents until, things got better. And Laurie really started believing this, and she started reading Chad's books, and she was going like it was the truth. She thought he was for real, although Chad just made it up. To him, it was kind of like a fantasy. He thought he could go behind the veil and communicate with dead people all the time, especially his grandfather, who was kind of like his main mentor in this. So Laurie would read these books, and she was really a groupie for him.
Right.
And when the opportunity finally came for her to meet him, that's when it all, started coming together, unfortunately.
As you said, gasoline and fire.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier Laurie's upbringing. She grew up, can we say, spoiled by parents in California who did not believe in taxes and battled the IRS for decades. Her father even self-published a book in 2019 titled How the American Public Can Dismantle the IRS.
Right.
How much do you believe these formative years informed her deranged development?
Well, her father actually went to jail for over a year because of, refused to pay taxes. To him, it was a religion not to pay taxes. And it was a very lax family. I mean, Laurie's mother used to walk around in hot pants, and she had a thing about her weight. She was always kind of dieting. And she would, one of the best interviews I got was with Laurie's best friend at Eisenhower High School, who told me about, how she saw Laurie change from this like normal kid into, her mother had told her that she was fat and she had to lose weight. So Laurie suddenly went on a diet, and she started kind of becoming, she changed her whole image, and she wanted to be loved, and she wanted to be popular, and she wanted the boys to like her. And that's when it kind of all started. And then, of course, there was the older brother, Alex, who it was strange to say the least. So Laurie's parents would just take off to Hawaii, her friend told me, for like a few weeks at a time. And they leave Alex all the money, and he had to feed the kids and keep them together. And he didn't. He spent the money on himself pretty much and left the kids to fend for themselves. And Laurie's friend told me, I think when they were in the 7th grade, one night they used to have sleepovers. And one night Laurie was very, very upset. And, her friend said, "What's wrong?" And they kind of hugged together. And Laurie said, "Well, Alex is coming on. He wants to have sex with me, and I don't know what to do." And both girls kind of hugged each other really close, and they didn't know what to do. And Laurie's friend told me that she was, she didn't even know to tell her mother. And it tortures her now that if she maybe told her mother about what was going on at the time, none of this might have happened.
Gosh, God, I mean, we could only speculate, right? John, I want to pick your brain. Do you think this kind of thinking, which is clearly shared by millions of Americans and even Britons of a certain political persuasion, is part and parcel with the pro-Trump, pro-Johnson right we've seen rise in the past half decade or so? This sort of cultish.
Well, I think it's social media and it's bad information, and especially when we see what's happened with COVID and the misinformation getting out there, which has been killing people.
Yes,
it's another layer of that. I think misinformation on the internet and everything, which people pick up and they believe, without any grounding. So I guess it is related to Trump and Boris Johnson in that way. Yeah.
Even before Laurie met Chad, she had a string of marriages that I think you describe in one chapter as a psychological hornet's nest. Can you speak to that a bit?
Well, actually, no, the psychological hornet's nest was Laurie's late sister, Stacy.
Oh, yes, you're right. Sorry about that.
Stacy was a very, very tragic figure. She suffered from type 1 diabetes. She was very sick. And she was bringing up her daughter, Melanie, Laurie, which is Laurie's niece. They were very close and became closer later. But Stacy wasn't eating properly. She was pretty well starving herself. And in the end, she died because of the diabetes. Yeah.
And did Laurie believe that Tylee, her teenage daughter, was the reincarnation of Stacy
Yes,
at some point?
later they were in analysis for various reasons with her son and daughter, Tylee and JJ. And Laurie suddenly told the psychiatrist that in fact she believed that Tylee was a reincarnation of Stacy, and also that she was talking to dead people all the time. You know, she was very close to the other side, and that scared that psychiatrist. You know, very much so.
Laurie, bizarrely, I mean, the sort of bizarre moment in the book for me came when you divulged that she appeared on the Wheel of Fortune in 2003 as a contestant.
Yes. In fact, she told people that she had a message from God that she was to appear on the Wheel of Fortune. So she actually did it, and it's online. You know, her thing where she's being questioned, you know, by the host and everything. And she actually won $15,000.
She did well, yeah.
Went on to enter the Mrs. Texas competition,
right.
Which I have in the book. I have pictures from that. And when she was interviewed, which is also online, somebody asked her about herself. She said, "Well, I'm a ticking time bomb." And Laurie had this very, very strange smile, very scary smile. And yeah.
John, before we continue, I'd like to look at some photos that St. Martin's Press, your publisher, sent us, and perhaps you can narrate as we review them.
Yeah, that's Laurie and Tylee in Hawaii, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was taken by a friend of Tyler's who I interviewed, and her mother. And, you know, this is when they were living there, and they were really having a good time at that point.
Do you know around when this photo was taken? Was it just before the murder?
I think it was probably a couple of years earlier, in fact, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's Larry and Kay Woodcocks, who to me are the heroes of this whole story. In fact, we have to get in. Laurie's fourth husband was Charles Vallow, who I think you want to talk to me about. And this is Charles's sister and brother-in-law. And they really, if it wasn't for them finding out what was going on and going to the police, then this, you know, we may never have known about Laurie and Chad. They may still be in Hawaii, happily married, with the two children still missing.
My God.
Yeah.
And this was at court, right? This was the trial, or where was this photo taken?
This is one of the hearings.
The hearings, okay.
The preliminary hearing of Chad. That's Chad's lawyer, John Pryor, and a lot of very disturbing testimony came out from the FBI about how the children were found. And it was a 2-day preliminary hearing, and it was really, really sad and horrible. And Kay and Larry sat through the whole thing. I don't know how they did.
Were you there for the hearing, John?
No, they streamed it live, so I watched it in this very room, in fact.
Okay.
Yeah. That's Melanie Gibb, who was one of Laurie's best friends and a big believer in Chad, in fact. She was part of the very closed, you know, cult until she realized that things weren't right. And she, in fact, taped a phone recording with Laurie and Chad, which was played at the preliminary hearing. And this is her testifying at it. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's Chad's, you know, after he got arrested, his mugshot. Yeah. And that's another picture of Larry and Kay at another hearing, I think, an earlier hearing, when Laurie first got arrested and was brought back to Rexburg, Idaho. Yeah, that's Laurie at the hearing. In fact, what's interesting about that is she'd just been arrested. This was one of the first hearings, and she actually had another inmate teach her how to make lipstick with, I think, some kind of red sweets they could get at the commissary, which she put on her lips, and it looked bizarre. You know, she had red lips and painted toenails.
And she's smirking.
She smirks all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are the kids.
That's really sad. That's obviously JJ and Tylee, you know, during happier times. And unfortunately, they were the victims of their mother and Chad. Gosh. And that's the last picture that was ever taken of Tylee. It was Yellowstone Park. pretty much a few days before she disappeared, and they went there with Alex. That's Laurie's brother I mentioned before.
Mhm.
Laurie probably took the picture. And after the children disappeared, the FBI put out this picture to try and get information of anyone that might have seen them that day at Yellowstone Park. But that was the very last time Tylee was ever seen.
Gosh. Tragic.
That's Ched at one of his prep rallies. In fact, he'd conjure fire and brimstone and the end of the world. And a lot of people really believed him. They thought he was charismatic.
Mm. Okay. Thank you, Zemina. Thank you, John. John, tell me about Laurie's marriage to Joe Ryan and how she involved her brother Alex at one point in a violent altercation with him.
Well, Joe was her third husband, actually. She was sort of in her mid-20s at that point. Joe was pretty successful when they met, and they got married, and Joe was really in love with Laurie. He built a house for them. But the problem was that he had a very, very bad temper, and he would, fly off the handle at any opportunity. And by that time, Laurie had her son Colby, and Tylee was in the picture too. And Joe Ryan could get he could lash out. He lashed out at Colby several times, and when the marriage broke up, Laurie called up the police in Arizona and complained that Joe Ryan has sexually molested Colby and Tylee. This was never proved, in fact, but that he was brought in for questioning. He was never arrested, but there was the court-ordered therapists that had to have family sessions to, examine what had happened, and that was when that came out. In fact, about Laurie claiming that Tylee was the reincarnation of her late sister Stacy. And there also, the therapists were convinced that Laurie was coaxing Tylee and Colby to come out with these molestation stories, because the stories would change, and Tylee would often look at her mother to make sure she was saying the right thing. Wow. So Joe Ryan was never actually charged, but Laurie wanted revenge, and she would fire up her brother Alex. Alex was I think in Phoenix. He was a stand-up comic for a while,
right?
And
he had a radio show too at some point. He got into trouble for.
No, that's his brother. Her other brother Adam was a shop in the morning.
A shop cook, right?
And Alex, in fact, who did stand-up comedy, and one of my best interviews was a lady called Mary Tracy, who actually performed with him and became very, very good friends with him. Anyway, Laurie would complain to Alex that Joe Ryan had molested the kids, really, and she'd tell him all these stories. So Joe Ryan decided to go and get go and get Joe. So at a visiting thing, Joe Ryan would have weekly visiting sessions at a special prearranged place. Joe Ryan was coming out of one of the visiting things with Tylee, and Alex came after him with a taser gun and attacked him with taser and tried to electrocute him. And they went to the ground, and there were other people in the car park, and Joe Ryan was screaming. So Alex ended up running away, and later it was discovered that in fact he went to his car, and Tylee and Laurie were actually watching the attack.
What a scene!
They were there. It was all set up. And later, Joe Ryan had a lot of heart problems, and his lawyer I spoke to is convinced that was what killed him, the tasering to the heart.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
Yeah.
Talk to us about, please, if you would, Laurie's husband, Charles, Mr. Vallow.
Yeah. Well, Charles was a very successful businessman in Arizona, and he actually met Laurie because Laurie was also a hairdresser. She was working in a hair salon at the time. She was bringing up Colby and Tylee and struggling, actually, after Joe Ryan. And she met Charles Vallow, who was completely enamored with her. And they kind of fell in love, and it seemed like it was the best relationship she'd ever had. And they got married, and Charles, was a very good, he earned a lot of money, and he kept her very well and the kids. Laurie didn't have to work. And for a while, it seemed to be a very happy marriage. And when this thing with Joe Ryan really blew up and Joe Ryan decided he wanted custody of Tylee, Laurie went off to live in Hawaii with Charles and Colby to get away from Joe Ryan. And they were there for like, I think, 6 or 7 years. And that was probably the happiest time the family ever had.
Was that period in Hawaii? Was it around 2014 when they had moved?
I think so. Mm-hmm.
And they moved back to Arizona, right?
Yeah, they moved back to Arizona. But at that time, I interviewed one of Laurie's close friends in Hawaii, April, who told me that Laurie was getting weirder and weirder about the Mormon religion. She was convinced that Charles wasn't devout enough for her. She had a lot of complaints. She didn't think he was involved in the religion enough. And by the time they moved back to Arizona, things were going bad in the marriage, in fact. Laurie had sort of moved on mentally.
When they moved back to Arizona, that's when she met Chad Daybell, right?
Soon afterwards, yes. Yeah.
Now, I remember this one scene in your book that was especially disturbing when Laurie spoke with Joe Ryan's sister about his decomposing corpse with a kind of, I think you described it, or she described it as a manic enthusiasm. What do you make of that? I mean, what kind of sociopathy is at play here?
Well, after Tylee went off to Hawaii, and he couldn't, he loved his daughter. He'd never had a family himself growing up. So his sister says, he looked to them as his family, and when he couldn't have them, he really resorted to alcohol, became an alcoholic. His work went down, and his lawyer told me, he was scavenging. He had to put him up, and eventually Joe Ryan died alone. I think it was in Phoenix. His body wasn't found for 3 weeks.
Oh my gosh!
The neighbor's dog smelled something untoward and called the police. It took them ages to actually track down Laurie, and Laurie would talk, and she would tell people with relish how Joe Ryan had died and the state his body had been in. I mean, It was really, really sick. It was like she got a thrill out of it. That's what Joe's sister says.
There's a passage that I wanted to read for our listeners. Laurie said something really eerie in the temple ceiling room on page 71 of your book. I'm just going to read this section. Your kids are adults in eternity. They're your friends. They're loaned to you for this short time. They're adults and they have their own missions and their own eternity to live. We do not need to worry about the souls of our children. We do not have to worry. Now, if perhaps her children hadn't died, that wouldn't be such a menacing statement. No. But context of what ended up happening to them, it's especially chilling.
Absolutely chilling. I mean, it was like her mindset, Chad's mindset, were that you got your physical bodies, but then you can be taken over by a zombie or whatever, and you'll have many, many lives and after that. So, and that was the rationale for the murders. In fact, that's what they were telling her brother Alex, who actually police are convinced he did kill the kids. And he was told that they become evil zombies, and the best thing he could do for them was to kill their physical bodies so their souls could be reincarnated, and it was the best thing that could be done for them. And that was the logic that I think Laurie believed.
Can you tell us?
Terrifying. I mean,
yeah, truly.
And people Alex believed that, and he resorted to murder.
Chad, too, had violent proclivities during his childhood, right? There were some episodes.
Well, he wrote his autobiography, and in it he talks about being 13, I think, and walking through a memorial park, and he suddenly saw some pollinating bees, on the ground, and he started stamping them to death one by one, and he actually counted 120 before his grandfather, whose spirit he saw all the time, ordered him to stop doing it.
Oh my gosh.
And also Chad was, he was a grave digger and a sexton. Besides
right.
a writer and a journalist. In fact, he was a professional sexton. He knew how to dig graves, and he had a fascination with grave digging. He even wrote a book about it. Excuse me.
really, sometimes people do telegraph their behavior.
Oh yeah.
Uh, um, can you discuss Chad's need for public acclaim? There was certainly a narcissistic streak, and
Right.
do you think Silver Creek Book Company's role catered to it?
Oh yeah. I mean, Chad. I mean, he wasn't satisfied being a sexton and running uh, cemeteries. In fact, he'd worked for local papers in Utah before that, and he tried his hand at writing, and he got a little publisher, I think in Springville, to publish one of his books. He went and started writing a trilogy to his daughter Emma. That was his first trilogy. And he liked to get the books out, and he then persuaded his wife Tammy that he should start a publishing company.
Mm.
And they did for a while. They got an office, they started producing books and signing authors. And Chad loved being an author and being a publisher. And he especially liked book signings. He would go around the Mormon bookstores and sign on Saturdays and get, do TV interviews and radio interviews. And he loved all that. I mean, it fed his ego.
Sure. At one point, Chad prophesizes that Lori's husband, Charles, will die in a car accident within the year. And when it didn't happen, Lori was, as you describe it, crestfallen.
Yeah.
How incredibly morose.
Yes.
And creepy. That she had this expectation that he would be dead. Like the same way she relished Joe Ryan's death and decay.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about Nick Schneider?
Well, Nick Schneider, when things really started to go downhill in the marriage in Chandler, Chad was influencing Lori. Chad had done like light and dark readings of everybody in Lori's family and friends. And Charles was particularly dark. I think he was a 4D, which was the worst you could get. Mm-hmm. And he suddenly called Lori up one day, and her friend Melanie was there when she took the phone call. And Chad told Lori that, in fact, he divined from from the other side of the veil that, in fact, Charles had been possessed by a spirit called Nick Schneider. And Nick Schneider was an associate in a form of Charles's who had died, but he'd taken over the body. And Lori seemed to have run with it and totally believed that this was no longer her husband, Charles Vallow, it was Nick Schneider. And she told Charles about that, who got very, very concerned.
It's like something right out of David Lynch, honestly.
Yeah, totally.
And then to take it a step further, Lori and her and Chad's followers began working together to summon their powers against the demon Nick Schneider, aka Charles Vallow, her husband.
Yeah, and they would have regular meetings, and they would pray and whatever for the power to drive Nick Schneider out of Charles's body, and they would have regular meetings together, to try and do this. But
wow.
So nonsense.
Then, of course, in 2019, Alex and Lori then killed Charles and made it look like self-defense. Is that the accusation? Or I know it still hasn't gone to trial yet, right? This is all sort of speculation.
I mean, it's not. I mean, I think it's more than speculation. I mean, things had got to the point where Charles hadn't died in the car crash, so they were going to take matters into their own hands. Mm-hmm. And so Alex was he was kind of given the role as his sister's protector, mm-hmm. to go and get Charles. And Charles was really, really worried about what was going on with Lori, the whole Nick Schneider thing. He thought that, she was mad. He tried to get her committed a few months earlier, but Lori was smart enough to talk her way out of it at the psychiatric hospital and get a clean bill of health. And Charles, in fact, started getting in touch with Lori's elder brother, Adam. This is Adam, the shop jock, DJ, who was also worried about Lori. And they decided they were going to have an intervention. And Lori found out about it. She found some of the emails or whatever. So she knew that Charles was coming for a visitation with JJ, Chandler, Arizona, where Lori was living with JJ at the time. So Alex was he was there waiting. So when Charles came in that morning, that's the last you ever heard. He came in and there was about a 45-minute break, and suddenly Alex calls 911 and says that he's just shot his brother-in-law to death because Charles was attacking him with a baseball bat. The police come. There's police video online, I'm sure a lot of people have seen, of Alex sitting on the pavement with a little scratch on the back of his head that he's wiping, and he tells police that Charles came in with a baseball bat and he was defending himself. They were interviewed by the police. Once again, these interviews are online, and the police didn't do anything. They were kind of suspicious because Laurie wasn't acting like her husband had just died. She was almost gleeful.
Right.
And there was a kind of thing where she's being interviewed by the police, and they said, "What happened?" when they first see her, and she says, "Oh, my husband just died. We've just moved into the area. Sorry, neighbors."
Oh my
That's her little gleeful smile again.
Wow.
It's bizarre. Wow. It made the papers. Brother-in-law got killed in self-defense. An investigation was started, but it was like more than a year before any action was taken, in which time there were a lot of other deaths that had been prevented.
And including, and I guess in the sequence, it was Tylee.
Tylee.
And it was JJ.
Also Tammy.
And Tammy. Tell us about Tammy, Chad's wife.
Yes.
Now that especially, because she died in her sleep, right? And did they perform a toxicology report to determine if it was, they did not, right?
No. I mean, Chad called 911, reported his wife had died. He told police that, in fact, she'd been really sick for ages. There was something wrong with her. She wasn't breathing properly. And he put it down to that. He didn't want to do an autopsy because he thought it would be too expensive and too much trouble. So that was waived. But the interesting thing was, like a week before, Tammy had spent some time with her sister, and she was actually in great shape. She was dancing because she was taking a dancing class, and she was actually training for a marathon at the time. So there was no way that she'd been sick, as Chad claimed.
Wow. Can you tell us about Brandon Bordeaux?
Well, Brandon Bordeaux was Laurie's niece, Melanie, who that's Stacy's daughter, who died.
Right.
Laurie got very close to Melanie, recently after she met Chad. And Melanie was kind of part of this whole cult, in fact. And Brandon was Melanie's husband. I think they had three or four children together. And suddenly Chad informed Melanie that Brandon, had been possessed or whatever. And police believe that, in fact, Alex was sent as a hitman. He turned up in an SUV. He was waiting for Brandon with his rifle ready. When Brandon came out of the house, he tried to shoot him, and he missed and drove off. But Brandon was convinced they were trying to kill him, and went on the run for a few weeks.
That would have been potentially the sixth death if he had succeeded.
Yeah.
What happened to Alex, Laurie's brother?
Well, there was eventually Kay Woodcock went to the police when she found out about, because Laurie went missing for a while. She suddenly took off to Rexburg, Idaho, to be near Chad, and that's when the whole cult converged. The Woodcocks, Kay and Larry, loved JJ, I mean, more than anything, and suddenly JJ disappeared, and Laurie wouldn't let them see him or even tell them where they were. And eventually Kay got on the computer one night and just happened to stumble on some Amazon orders that Laurie had made through Charles, her brother's account, and managed to trace where they are, called the police and got a welfare check. And that's where everything went down. The police came, they interviewed Chad, they interviewed Alex, they interviewed Laurie. And the next thing, they came back for the next day, that was around Thanksgiving, 2019, and everyone disappeared. Laurie and Chad took off to Hawaii. Alex and whatever took off, and the police were getting closer and closer. And I think Alex realized his time was up. I mean, Melanie Gibb, in fact, told him that, you know, she knew that he'd done something and the police were on his case. And I think Alex had a bad heart, he had bad blood pressure, and he went to get some pills from Mexico, came back, and a couple of days later was found dead in his house.
My God! So this is he's the sixth death.
Yeah, yeah. But there was a suspicion about what happened. The police said he died of natural causes, but nobody will ever know.
Sure.
I think guilty conscience myself.
Sure, I think carrying that kind of stress can give someone heart failure.
Right.
How did the police finally find Laurie's children, Tylee and JJ? And it was the summer of 2020, right, when they were finally discovered?
Well, the FBI were called in, and they finally arrested Laurie on suspicion of, because she refused to say where JJ and Tylee were. She told everyone she was protecting them. So eventually the police arrested her because she hadn't produced them in court where she should have done. And so she's in jail for 3 or 4 months. Chad's out on the loose and everything. And the FBI get involved. And they start looking at Alex's cell phone. And they start looking at cell phone towers and where he was the time when Tylee disappeared and JJ disappeared. And they realized that he was on Chad Daybell's property. And he spent time on Chad Daybell's property in the garden. So they kind of cross-referenced all these cell phone towers. And they turned up, I think it was June 2020, and they started digging up the whole garden. And that's when they first found JJ's body. And the next day they found Tylee's body. And it's indescribable, the condition the bodies were in. It was horrible.
Truly horrible.
Yeah.
We'll be taking questions for John shortly, so please start sending them in. John, what is the status of Laurie and Chad now?
Well, that's what's interesting. They've both been accused of murder, the children's murder, Tammy's murder, and they were supposed to be tried together. And I think about 9 months ago or so, suddenly Chad Daybell, they joined the cases together, and Laurie was found incompetent to stand trial. She was told to undergo, I think, 180 days psychiatric analysis. So she's been deemed incompetent, while Chad is still awaiting trial for January 2023. Interesting thing was, this very day, in fact, Laurie came up into court for a competency hearing to see whether she was now competent, but the hearing was sealed, so there's no way of knowing yet what's going on there.
And of course, you'll continue to track it.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
What was the reporting like for you? This all just unfolded within the past 2 years or so, and you captured it so fully and so quickly. What is your process like?
Well, it was very intense. I mean, I got as much as I could get. I was lucky. I got a lot of the main players agreed to talk to me and give me exclusive interviews for it. But things were basically literally changing by the day. I might, go and check the news and something new had happened. So it was just constantly evolving, and I was constantly rewriting right till my deadline, in fact.
No.
It's a fast-paced story, and it hasn't finished yet. So I'm thinking, maybe another edition, I could write another chapter.
Right. Maybe you were saying maybe for when the book comes out in paperback, you can add an additional chapter. Yeah. How do you think such a terrible thing like this happens, John? Do you think it's a problem of religious fanaticism or something in our culture that engenders it? You mentioned earlier social media. If you had to put on your sociologist cap and kind of make sense of how this sort of thing happens?
I don't know. I think maybe people in this world, they're looking for something extraterrestrial, something different, something they can kind of lose themselves in, and they're open to these kind of crazy religious cults. Really, they're very accessible, and there's a lot of controlling people, that know how to use it. I mean, in fact, I interviewed probably the cult specialist in America, Rick Ross, who told me it basically came down to it was a cult of two, Chad and Laurie, and that was enough to make a cult.
We have a question from our viewers. Is this zombie cult Chad followed still around? What happened to Melanie?
Is that Melanie Gibb? I guess they mean Melanie Gibb is still around. She's given a lot of interviews and whatever. There was no suspicion that she ever knew what was really going on. And as far as I know, the cult isn't there anymore. Although I think there are still preppers that believe in, maybe a milder form of it, but not as strongly as Chad preached.
And certainly there must be dozens, if not hundreds, of these types of cults throughout the world or the country, certainly.
Since time immemorial, there have been, yeah,
Sure.
unfortunately.
Here's another question, John. Who were the most important sources for you in writing this book? Was this one of the most challenging books for you to write in your career?
Yes, it definitely was one of the most challenging. I mean, it was very, very scary to me that people could actually believe, that the world is inhabited by evil zombies, and that their closest, nearest and dearest relations, their spouses or their sons and daughters, could be taken over by evil spirits. I mean, it's just unbelievable to me and very, very scary. And I think my one very good interview I had was with April Raymond, who got to know Laurie and Charles Vallow when they lived in Hawaii for 3 or 4 years and became very, very good friends and loved Charles, got on really well with them and the children. Mm-hmm. And she saw how Laurie changed. In fact, Laurie actually went to Hawaii to try and recruit her into the 144,000 and tried to preach this, and April didn't want anything to do with it.
More rational minds prevailed in that situation, thankfully. What are you working on next, John?
I'm doing a book in another strange book, the Alex Murdaugh, Murdaugh family in South Carolina, in Hampton. In fact, the family for over 100 years kind of ruled 5 counties in the low country of South Carolina. They were the prosecutors, basically, the solicitors of the 14th district.
Oh, interesting.
And there's been a lot of strange murders around Alex Murdaugh, a lot of strange happenings. So I'm immersed in that at the moment.
Was this a St. Martin's Press book?
Yes, yeah, they've commissioned it.
Do you know when that will be released? You're still writing.
I'm still writing, yeah. That's moving very fast too.
All right. Well, that's all for tonight, everyone. John, thank you so much for this this hour. It's been really riveting and disturbing and really insightful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Have a nice weekend.
All right, thank you.
Bye.